All right, before we get to our empathy lesson, I wanted to give you a brief introduction to the surface of the human brain. So this is a human brain, and it is the left half of the brain. We're looking at the outer surface called the cerebral cortex. The person would be looking to the left, so the eyes would be over here, the spinal cord coming down here. Here's the cerebellum. But we're going to focus on this bit of tissue here called the cerebral cortex. And it's color-coded, and there are words here written here, and the words stand for what researchers think is happening in that part of the brain. What kinds of computations or what purpose, what function different parts of the brain are serving. For example, the back part of the cortex is visual cortex. And how do we know that? Three general types of evidence to support that. One is that people with damage to this part of the brain report blindness. But two other types of evidence involve modern technology. We can now electrically stimulate regions of the brain and then see what happens in the patient's experience. And if you electrically stimulate this back part of the brain here, people report spots of light and other kinds of visual sensations. And finally, we can just record when is this area of the brain electrically excited, and that happens when our eyes are open and we're awake and we're seeing stuff. When we close our eyes, activity diminishes. We open our eyes, activity increases. So we call this the visual cortex, and because this part of the brain is processing visual information. Ultimately, it's sent from our eyes, but it is being processed in this part of the brain, and then these brain cells will be sending the results of that processing to other parts of the brain. For example, down here we have what they've termed here a recognition area. Here we have stored memories of what things look like, so that if we see some object and it matches something we have stored in memory, we'll say, ah, yes, I recognize that object. Let's take a look at some other sensory areas here in the temporal lobe. So we've got the temporal lobe here. It's kind of underneath our temporals. And we have the frontal lobe. This part would be the frontal lobe, parietal lobe back here, and then the occipital lobe. The temporal lobe has a brain region devoted to sound processing, so hearing would be here. Again, if we damage this area, people report deafness. The purple area here would be a strip of cortex that is sort of like a map of the surface of our skin. So this is our touch sensory cortex. If somebody touches us on the foot, a certain region of this area will become activated because the nerves from the foot will send their signals up to this part of the sensory strip. But being touched on the hand, for example, would activate a different part of this strip. So there's sort of like a map of our body surface here in this strip. We can think of the visual cortex as a map of sort of space out there, and the hearing section is kind of a map of the acoustic world as well. So if we step back and take a look, the back part of the brain then has three of our main sensory systems. And we can think of the back part as devoted to answering the question, what is happening in the world? What's going on in the world? What am I seeing? What am I feeling? What am I recognizing? What am I hearing? Etc. And I might be hearing language. Notice we have a language comprehension system in the back as well. In contrast, if we take a look overall at the front part of the brain, it seems to be more involved with what are we going to do in the world? What are we going to do in the next moment or at some future time? So we have thinking, judgment, feeling, speech, forethought, and of course the movement system itself, the turquoise region here. This would be motor cortex, and these would be nerve cells that send signals down to ultimately move our body. So this is the motor system, and we have plans to make movements. We have the movement programs itself. Speech is a form of behavior. But of course, before we behave, we're going to be making judgments, and feelings will be part of our decision-making processes, and we'll be thinking and using working memory, and etc. So we can think of the front part of the brain as devoted to processing sort of what are we going to do in response to what the back part is detecting in our environment and at the surface of our skin, for example. Now, before we get to the empathy unit then and the role of mirror neurons in the empathy story, let's just kind of, part of the reason why it was sort of an interesting discovery, these mirror neurons, is because the back part of the brain was sort of understood to be a perceptual part of the brain, where if we were recording the activity of cells in the back part of the brain, yeah, they might respond to some stimulus in the environment, whether it be visual stimulus or a sound stimulus or a touch stimulus, right? So these would be perceptual neurons, you might say. Whereas neurons in the front part of the brain, in the motor systems, they were thought to be sort of motor neurons. These are neurons that are active when we're actually moving. Now, it was well known that, of course, the back part of the brain has to communicate with the front part of the brain in order to have intelligent behavior. But nevertheless, when researchers started to discover neurons up in the frontal part of the brain, kind of near Broca's area here, the speech area, the inferior frontal lobes here, this was a region that had what are called mirror neurons. And the interesting thing about these mirror neurons was that not only were they active when the animal, in this case monkey, was performing an action, but they became responsive when the animal was watching somebody else perform that action, right? So it's as if these neurons up here had two kinds of properties. They had motor properties involved in movement, motion, and perceptual properties. They would respond to perception, even if the animal itself was not moving. It turns out there's another population of mirror neurons in the inferior parietal lobe as well, and in fact, more recently, there are some other areas that have these kind of dual properties, motor properties and perceptual properties. But that means that these populations of cells, these mirror neurons, serve as a link between the perceptual systems and the action systems. And that has important implications for our topic of empathy.